everyone, and good morning. I'm glad to see everybody here. People are still filling in, but this is the event Community-Based is the Future of Refugee Resettlement. My name is Julia Hutchin. I know I've seen a few of your names, and so I'll be the moderator for this session. On behalf of NARHC, we are very glad to see you here today. This is our last day of the conference, and it's been great, so we're going to hit it off on a really great note. To begin, a few housekeeping notes is attendee audios will be off during this presentation. Questions can be written into the chat or written into the Q&A, and then comments can be in the chat portion. So if questions arise post-workshop when everything is done, there's an email address that we'll put into the chat box where people can send in questions up to 10 days after the events for some answered questions by the panelists. And then, yeah, for this event, we will be hearing from Chris George. For the past 16 years, Chris George has been the Executive Director of the IRS, Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services, the New Haven-based Refugee Resettlement Agency that welcomes hundreds of refugees to Connecticut each year. Chris has spent most of his professional life living in or working on the Middle East. Before returning to Connecticut in 2004, he worked 7 years in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Chris directed a legislative strengthening project with the Palestinian Parliament and later established an emergency assistance program for Palestinian nonprofits. Without further ado, I'm very glad to be introducing you today, Chris George. I'll hand it over to you, and thank you for being here.
Hey, well, thanks for having me. So yes, I've been running a refugee resettlement agency in New Haven. It's called Iris, like the flower, for the past 15 years. And we have been using a model of community-based resettlement, which has worked wonderfully in Connecticut, and we think it should work beautifully across the United States. So that's what the talk is about today, and I'd love to hear your comments or questions about the implications of a community-based model like this, especially for refugee healthcare. So I think we ought to begin. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, today I want to talk to you about community-based refugee resettlement. This is an approach to refugee resettlement that engages groups of volunteers and entrusts them with the tasks of resettling refugees. It's an approach that's good for refugees, it strengthens refugee resettlement agencies, and it can lead to increased numbers of refugees coming to the United States. It's also a great way to educate Americans, but most of all, it is a model that builds public support for refugees and refugee resettlement. And that's why I'm promoting it today. Many years ago, this was the way most refugees were welcomed to the United States. Groups of volunteers stepping forward, welcoming new Americans. But for the past few decades, the approach, or the model of community-based resettlement has fallen out of favor. And it's been replaced by professional staff in refugee resettlement nonprofits doing most of the work. What I'm going to propose going forward is a hybrid model in which we combine the expertise of the refugee resettlement agencies with the expertise and the enthusiasm of American volunteers. I'm going to describe community-based refugee resettlement. I'm going to contrast it to the standard way of currently resettling refugees. I'm going to describe the advantages of community-based resettlement, and I'm going to discuss the reasons why many refugee organizations have not yet embraced this model. But before we go further, let's agree on terminology. We call this community-based resettlement or community co-sponsorship because often the entire community is involved. All across the community, volunteers stepping forward from a mosque, from a synagogue, from a church, from a university, from a Rotary Club. So we refer to it as community co-sponsorship. Co-sponsorship because the Refugee Resettlement Agency is the sponsor and a group that has been engaged to help the refugee agency is referred to as the co-sponsor. What distinguishes this model from other approaches that engage volunteers is the high level of trust and responsibility that we give to these groups. In community co-sponsorship, the groups do virtually all of the resettlement tasks that are normally done by the staff of a refugee resettlement agency. It's a model that's been used in the past in the United States, and today many countries around the world are adopting community-based resettlement, or community or private sponsorship is sometimes called. Some of my colleagues who work in refugee resettlement will sometimes say that the job of welcoming refugees is too difficult and too delicate to involve volunteers. My perspective is the job of welcoming persecuted people from all over the world and helping them start new lives in this country is too important not to involve volunteers. So that's a basic premise behind community-based resettlement. Some basic background to make sure we're all starting at the same place. What is a refugee? I probably don't need to remind most of you. A person who has fled his or her country because of a well-founded fear of persecution, because of their race, their religion, nationality, particular social group, or political opinion. You all know there are about 26 million refugees in the world today. A tiny fraction of those 26 million have an opportunity to be resettled in another country. The United States of America has historically had the largest refugee resettlement program in the world. We normally bring between 70,000 and 80,000 refugees to the United States. Not anymore. How does refugee resettlement work? Well, it begins overseas. Refugees are interviewed and vetted by the Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security. They go through the most rigorous vetting process in the world. And then once they have passed through the security vetting process, there is a health screening. They need to take out loans to cover their airfare. And then they're placed with one of 9 large refugee resettlement organizations, which in turn place them with one of about 200 smaller nonprofits. They're called affiliates, spread across the United States. My organization, IRIS, Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services, is one of those 200 affiliates, and we're connected to one of the 9 national organizations. So that's the basic structure of refugee resettlement. Now, after the refugee family has passed through this vetting process, they're packing their bags. The Refugee Resettlement Agency gets an email that says a family of 5 from Iraq, or a family of 6 from Afghanistan, or maybe a family of 4 from Syria, whatever it is. They're arriving in 2 weeks. That's the email. We usually have about 2 weeks' notice. My amazing staff will then spring into action, find an apartment, furnish it with donated furniture, stock the kitchen with 3 or 4 days worth of food, and then find someone in the community who can cook a culturally appropriate hot meal to serve this family, this arriving refugee family, within 2 hours of their arrival. That's a federal government requirement, by the way, the culturally appropriate hot meal. We get all of this ready. The family arrives at the airport, or we meet them, in our case, in New Haven, Connecticut. If it's cold, we bundle them up with hats and scarves and gloves, all of it donated. We take them to their apartment. They have that culturally appropriate hot meal. They have a great night's sleep. And then the next day, we bring them to the office and we go through the program. The staff will sit down with them, and now it's done virtually, and go over the services that they can expect from us and what we can expect from them. First, we say we're going to connect you to healthcare. In Connecticut, we are fortunate to have an amazing partner in Yale New Haven Hospital that has institutionalized services for refugees. There is an adult refugee clinic and a children's refugee clinic, and I'm sure there are a couple of people from Yale New Haven Hospital in this conference. If you're listening to me now, thank you very much for your amazing services. We will also enroll the children in school. We'll help the family learn English, and we'll help them get a job. And we have to do all of this as quickly as we can because we really don't have that much money. And the family is expected to hit the ground running. Employees of the refugee resettlement agencies will do most of the work. They will use some volunteers, but generally the work is done by the staff. So this is a demanding, you have to hit the ground running, self-help program for refugees. Being a refugee in the United States is not easy. We don't lavish all kinds of assistance on you. You're expected to take the first job that's offered and become self-sufficient as soon as possible. But before you know it, the kids are learning English really well. They're winning academic awards. They're stars on their soccer teams. Parents are learning English. They're getting their jobs, in some cases their very first job. They're learning how to pay the rent, cover the utility bills, and they're slowly becoming self-sufficient and beginning to integrate into the community. This is really an amazing program. It's happening all across the country. Now, we should be welcoming 80,000 or so refugees a year to the United States. This year it is only 8,000, far fewer numbers, but still refugees are arriving at a trickle. Refugee resettlement is our oldest and most noble American tradition. Our poster child is Albert Einstein. It's one of our best foreign policies. The symbol of this program is the Statue of Liberty. It's happening in our own backyards. So why don't more Americans know about it? Well, when I started working in refugee resettlement about 15 years ago, my New Haven-based nonprofit, Interfaith Refugee Ministry, was probably best described as a well-kept secret. My first year on the job, I was constantly meeting people. I mean, well-connected people, people very familiar with the nonprofit scene, had never heard of the organization. And I'm sure that many of you who work in refugee resettlement have noticed the same thing. How has this happened? Well, it has to do with the way refugees have been resettled over the past 40 years, and helps to take a quick look at the history of refugee resettlement to understand why so few people know about it. For hundreds of years, refugees have come to the United States. Many were welcomed informally by friends and relatives, faith-based groups, churches, and synagogues. Some charities were involved, but it was a very informal system. Short on money, short on organization, but very rich in community engagement and involvement of the private sector. A lot of private citizens and communities were actively involved in welcoming refugees. There were in-kind donations and lots of volunteers. I often meet people in their 40s, 50s, 60s who tell me that they remember their family or a community group welcoming a volunteer from Southeast Asia or from Hungary. It might not have been a well-organized system or well-regulated, but it was a system that resettled a lot of refugees. In fact, in 1980, more than 200,000 refugees from Southeast Asia were resettled in the United States. And that's before the current system was created. In 1980, Congress signed the Refugee Act, and the federal government decided to organize refugee resettlement. The government took over control of resettlement, but they delegated the work to private voluntary organizations. You could say the government privatized refugee resettlement. The government provided a little bit of funding, a lot of regulations, and then something interesting and totally unexpected happened, and unintentional. As the role of the nonprofit refugee resettlement agencies increased, the involvement of community groups and volunteers decreased. And this has been a trend. The greater the professionalization, the less community involvement. It's happened over the past 40 years. And during this time, the U.S. has welcomed more than 3 million refugees. Now, we can agree that during this period, we, the refugee resettlement agencies, we've done a pretty good job of providing those basic services to refugees. Housing, healthcare, enrolling the kids in school, helping them learn English, helping them find jobs. We've done a pretty good job of providing those basic services. But we have to admit, until very recently, we have not done a good job of educating Americans about refugees, and we have not done a good job of engaging the public in refugee resettlement. Now, to be fair, over the past 2 or 3 years, there has been a change. In fact, the State Department now requires every refugee resettlement agency to hold quarterly community consultations, where members of the community are invited in to be briefed on refugee resettlement work. But for most of the past 40 years, the nonprofit groups worked largely by themselves, and the resettlement program kept a low profile. You could say that we kind of flew under the radar for many years. We were almost singularly focused on providing those basic services to refugees. Meeting government requirements, housing, meet the family at the airport, connect them to healthcare, enroll the kids in school, help them learn English, help them find a job. Next family, meet them at the airport, housing, enroll them in school, healthcare, English, help them find a job. Next family. Refugee resettlement became a kind of logistical challenge for the nonprofits involved. Those of us who worked in refugee resettlement agencies, we lived in fear of being monitored by the State Department, audited in State Department visits. The rules and the regulations were strict, and they took the joy out of welcoming refugees. The State Department, Department of Health and Human Services gave us just enough funding so that we could meet the minimum standards. We didn't have to raise private funds to survive, and we didn't have to engage the private sector. We quietly got the work done with the federal funding, and we met those minimum standards. Doing just the minimum for refugees was not only the result of scarce resources, it was an approach that was conveniently tied to the US government philosophy of rapid self-sufficiency. In other words, there was little encouragement to do more than the minimum that would require raising private funds or engaging the community. We worked by ourselves, sometimes with the help of volunteers, occasionally recruiting a church or a synagogue or a mosque to help out with the tasks, like setting up an apartment, driving refugees to an appointment, tutoring kids in school, job coaching. We used volunteers for specific one-off tasks. But in general, we believe that resettling refugees was a job for experienced professionals. And when immigration became a controversial topic, we were not sure if the public would understand the difference between a refugee and an undocumented immigrant, and we weren't comfortable suggesting that refugees should be supported over undocumented immigrants, so our response was just to keep our head down. A low profile, flying under the radar. For nearly 40 years, we flew under the radar, not engaging the public, receiving just enough federal funding. We're too busy to do anything other than basic services. No time for community outreach. We were afraid of the press, so it's no mystery that most Americans knew nothing about refugee resettlement. We didn't think it was a problem. I mean, refugees continued to come. The contracts continued to be signed. There was sufficient support in Congress. But it was the presidential campaign of 2015 and 2016 that was a wake-up call for all of us involved in refugee resettlement. We were facing an existential threat. And as we scrambled to find support to protect this dear American treasure, as we scrambled to find support, we learned that the average U.S. citizen and even some elected officials were not aware of the Refugee Resettlement Program. And if the public isn't aware of something, if the public doesn't know what we're doing, how can we expect them to support us? So now we understand the importance of public support. We need the public to know what we are doing. It's not enough to rent apartments, to connect people to healthcare, to enroll kids in school, to help them learn English, to find jobs for refugees. These are the essential services that must be done, but we have to do more. We have a role as refugee resettlement professionals, in fact, an obligation, and now a strategic imperative to involve Americans, to educate Americans, to engage Americans in this mission of welcoming refugees and helping them start new lives. So the question then is, what is the best strategy to help Americans understand and support refugee resettlement? I'll say it again. What is the best strategy to increase public support for refugee resettlement? Brochures, public events, panel discussions, press coverage, books about refugees, films about refugees. Yes, all of the above. But the best way to get Americans to really understand and support refugee resettlement is to get them involved in refugee resettlement. And the best way to involve large numbers of volunteers and to provide a profound personal experience is to use the community co-sponsorship model. We need to engage groups of volunteers, people who come together motivated to help refugees. Now, back in the days when I used to go to the office in New Haven, I would often meet new volunteers who were there for their first day, and I would ask them, why are you here? What moved you to volunteer at my refugee resettlement agency, IRIS? And inevitably, they would mention, I was watching the news and I was just fed up with the horrible things that are going on in the world, watching refugees trying to cross the Mediterranean and drowning in the process. I was sickened by the hateful rhetoric coming out of Washington and the cruel policies that were being adopted by our government. I just had to do something, they said. I just had to do something. millions of Americans want to do something. The refugee resettlement agencies that are spread across the United States, remember there are 200 of them, are in a perfect position to take advantage of this moral, civic need to do something. Since 2015, when the refugee crisis dominated the news and the world was facing the worst refugee crisis ever, there has been enormous nationwide interest in helping refugees. People just want to do something to show their concern for refugees and immigrants and to demonstrate their opposition to the administration's policies. I'm sure that nearly every refugee agency in the country uses volunteers in a variety of ways. We use volunteers to help set up apartments and drive refugees to appointments, help them get jobs. All of these are important tasks, and this should continue. But what I'm talking about today is working with volunteer groups and entrusting them with responsibilities that normally would be held very tightly by refugee resettlement agency staff. In 2015 and 2016, more than 40 groups were knocking down our door at IRIS in New Haven. There were churches, there were synagogues, mosques, universities, Rotary clubs, book clubs, even a used car dealership was interested in resettling refugees. They had heard about this community-based model and they wanted to do it. They said, we want to welcome a refugee family to our community, train us, supervise us, but please place a refugee family with us. We will do everything that your staff does. All of the services that your staff provide for refugees in New Haven, we will do for the refugees in our towns. Well, I said, that's great. We'll train you, we'll place refugee cases with you, we'll oversee the work. This will be a partnership. So we are here when you need us, but you will be responsible for all of the work. Truth is, we did not have a community co-sponsorship program at the time. Sure, we had worked with groups, but over my first 10 years on the job, an average of one group per year volunteered to be a community co-sponsor. They're usually churches, an occasional synagogue. But it was not an organized program. And we were not really ready for these 40 groups that were demanding to join us. But we were not going to turn them away. No, this was the chance of a lifetime for a refugee resettlement agency. It was like an enormous tidal wave of enthusiastic groups demanding to participate in refugee resettlement. And then in front of this tidal wave were my staff and me running ahead of them, pulling together documents, writing policies, figuring out how we were going to put this program together. But we did it. And now we have a rigorous application process. We have a detailed training manual. We have a required all-day training session that groups go through. Thanks to the support of these 40 groups, in 2016, we were able to more than double the number of refugees that we resettled in Connecticut. We went from 230 to 530. So why is it so important to work with groups of volunteers? What advantages does a group have over individual volunteers? Well, in general, it is more efficient to work with a group. Instead of having to coordinate with 15 to 50 individual volunteers, you coordinate with one chairperson who in turn will organize and manage the others. A group can do so much more than just individuals. A group can discuss issues, identify problems on their own, solve problems on their own, take the initiative, and make sure that things get done. There's something about that group dynamic that makes it more efficient. I don't know whether it's peer pressure or just something magical that happens within a group. Another benefit of working with community groups, they come up with new ideas. They'll advocate for the refugee family that they're helping. They'll ask questions. They'll make comments. They'll offer suggestions. And yes, they will point out our shortcomings. They can be a pain, but they make our programs stronger. Most important, they can take on many responsibilities. And this is key. We give our groups ownership over the process. When you give a lot of responsibility to a group of people, amazing things happen. They take their job extra seriously. It's like they become super volunteers. Sometimes I don't even use the word volunteer when I describe community co-sponsors, because they're in a category, far above the typical volunteer. They do a terrific job. Now, the more responsibility, the greater the satisfaction. This is basic to human beings. The more responsibility you give to someone or to a group, the greater the satisfaction they get out of doing the job. The more a volunteer has human-to-human contact, the deeper the experience. And that translates to powerful public support. Now, I heard a story about a group of volunteers who were working in the Washington, D.C. area. They were asked by a refugee resettlement agency to set up an apartment. And like most community co-sponsorship groups or groups of volunteers, they did a spectacular job. I'm sure they were scrubbing the floor of the kitchen. They were also cleaning the bathtub and the toilet in the bathroom. They went out and bought new curtains for the windows. They made all the beds. They placed age-appropriate toys on the children's bed. They got everything ready. And before the refugee family arrived, the head of the group contacted the Refugee Resettlement Agency and said, we would really love to meet this family when they arrive. Is that possible? And the director of the refugee agency said, no, absolutely not. You can't meet the refugee family. Why not? You can give an orientation to this group, tell them what they can do and cannot do, give them a little bit of cross-cultural training. You could even have staff there to make sure that they don't do anything inappropriate. But let them meet the family. In a community co-sponsorship program, the kind that we run, a well-trained group sets up the apartment, meets the family at the airport without our staff involved. They're on their own. They've been trained. They know how to do it. They meet the refugee family at the airport. They take them to their apartment. They serve them that culturally appropriate hot meal. They love making culturally appropriate hot meals. They show them around the apartment, how things work, and they bring them into, their office, or they visit them the next day, and they go over the program the same way our staff would go over the program. For the next 6 to 12 months, they're helping this family get off to a good start. And when you talk to people who have been involved as co-sponsors in refugee resettlement, they'll say, oh my gosh, this is the best experience I've ever had. I have learned so much working with refugees. I've learned about their lives and their world. I've learned about the United States and the process of helping them. Honestly, I think I have benefited more from the experience than did the refugees. Now, of course, every community co-sponsorship is not perfect. Things can go wrong. But the biggest problem that we have with community groups is they want to do too much for too long. But with oversight, the agency is constantly supervising the work, and with good oversight, the refugee agency can solve problems before they get out of hand. I tell my staff, who are incredible, you do a great job of resettling refugees. but we can't keep it all to ourselves. Welcoming and resettling refugees in the United States is too important to be done by a small number of professionals. We have to swing open the doors and invite other Americans to come in and participate in this amazing tradition of welcoming refugees. It needs to be shared with the broadest number of people. I mentioned early in my talk that there is sometimes controversy swirling around immigration work and even the refugee program. And avoiding this controversy is one reason why refugee resettlement agencies kept a low profile. Well, a group of volunteers from a community with respect and credibility from other people in the community can deal with criticism in some ways much better than a refugee agency. Let me give you an example of what I mean. There's a community group that has signed on to be a co-sponsor. They've gone through training, they've been raising money, they're preparing for a refugee family to arrive, and they decide to hold a town hall meeting in their town to talk about this initiative and to try to drum up support and to answer questions. At this public meeting, there might be some pushback from people in town. Let's say a middle-aged man stands up, holds the microphone, and says, "Why are we putting our resources into these foreigners when we've got people born in this country, living in this town, friends and neighbors who need help? Shouldn't we be helping them instead of refugees?" So who answers this man? Is it me, the director of a refugee resettlement agency, 45 miles away, who is a total stranger to people in this town? Not only am I a stranger, but I'm a paid professional. I depend on refugee resettlement for my job, for my salary. How much credibility am I going to have? No. Instead, the head of the local refugee resettlement committee grabs the mic. She is a mother of 4, a respected community leader, used to be a teacher of 7th grade in the local school, and she says, "Sam," the man who asked the question, she said, "Sam, thank you for coming tonight. You ask a good question. Sam, you and I have lived most of our lives in this town, and you know that we can do both. We can help refugees and we can help our friends and neighbors. And in fact, Sam, we have helped our friends and neighbors in many ways. So let's help a family that is fleeing a war-torn area where they've suffered persecution and help them the same way that our grandparents were welcomed to the United States. Sam, I hope you join the group." They say all politics is local. Well, you could say the same thing about refugee resettlement. Grassroots local support is essential. And I've been telling you how great this model of community-based resettlement is. All of the advantage of community co-sponsorship. You might be asking, well, why doesn't every refugee agency in the country embrace this model? Well, it's a good question. Over the years, I have learned that there are a number of reasons why refugee resettlement agencies are a little reluctant to use community co-sponsorship, and we'll talk about each of these reasons. One is really very basic, and that is some agencies still don't see the importance of building public support. They are still almost exclusively focused on providing services to refugees, and they just don't have the time, the resources, or the interest in doing other things that could build public support. That's a mistake, and hopefully that'll change. Another reason: many refugee resettlement agencies assume that the US government, which controls and regulates the refugee resettlement program. They assume that the United States government, the Department of State, does not allow the basic core services that are required under the contract to be delegated to volunteers. Well, these are outlined in a document called the Cooperative Agreement, a long list of tasks with strict timelines, setting up the apartment, what kind of furniture goes in the apartment, meeting at the arrival point, the culturally appropriate hot meal, the refugee health assessment has to be done within 30 days, application for social security cards, enrolling the kids in school. All of these things have to be done in a certain period of time. Well, we have checked the Cooperative Agreement, and we have checked with the Bureau of Population, Refugee, and Migration, PRM, at the State Department, and they say that as long as the refugee agency, the affiliate, takes responsibility, it doesn't matter who does the work. It could be done by staff, it could be done by interns, it could be done by volunteers, it could be done by co-sponsors. As long as the Refugee Resettlement Agency takes responsibility, the State Department says, anyone can do the tasks. So then it comes down to a question of trust. That's right, trust. My colleagues will say, you can't trust an ad hoc collection of semi-retired, baby boomer, amateur do-gooders to resettling refugees. If they mess up, we're held responsible, my colleagues say. And if we're monitored, again, this word strikes fear in the hearts of refugee resettlement professionals. If we are monitored by the State Department and it's discovered that certain things were not done according to the rules and regulations, we could be found non-compliant. And if that happens, the number of arrivals assigned to us will be cut. And that means our budget will be cut. It's a disaster. So if it's a question of trust, let's take a look at the makeup of a co-sponsorship group. Most of the groups we work with are coalitions, like I said, pulling people together from across the community, sometimes 50, 100, even 150 members. Let's look at a list of the kinds of people who step forward to serve on these co-sponsorship groups. Retired superintendent of schools, a part-time social worker, a retired cardiologist whose parents came from Lebanon, a retired Wall Street executive, former member of a town council, an immigration attorney, a mother who raised a family of 5 and now works part-time as a realtor, the president of a local Rotary Club who happens to be a Pakistani immigrant, a Girl Scout troop, a political science professor and her entire class, the pastor of a local church and its youth group, the rabbi from a local synagogue, the imam from the local mosque, and the manager of a used car dealership. They all live in the area. They all grew up in town. Most have families and kids in the school system. With some training, with oversight, this group can resettle a refugee family. You can trust them. And the outcomes for the refugee family are impressive. If we look at the 2 main goals of the U.S. government refugee resettlement program, self-sufficiency and integration into the community, this co-sponsorship model does very well compared to the standard staff-based approach. In general, refugees resettled by co-sponsorship groups get jobs sooner or as soon as refugees that are resettled by staff, and they integrate into their local communities much faster. So once the refugee family arrives, the group members will do all the basic services. At the same time, they will also become their friends. And this is big. Friends. Refugees need friends as much as they need a case manager. And friends who can take time to explain things to them and to help them navigate this strange new world. Co-sponsors have time to explain to refugees the difference between a rat and a squirrel. Maybe there isn't that much difference. They can give advice on what their kids should wear to school, what a parent-teacher conference is all about, how to rake leaves, how to shovel snow. And why do Americans have posters all over the restrooms describing how they need to wash their hands as though they're the cleanest people in the world, but then they allow dogs into their homes and even on their beds? Community-based resettlement is a person-to-person, bottom-up, grassroots movement. It's a rare example of civic activity in this country. I mean, how often do we see groups of people coming together from across the religious and socioeconomic and political spectrums, working together on a community project, meeting on weekends or in the evenings, now on Zoom, to welcome and resettle a refugee family that has fled persecution and wants to build a new life. Community-based resettlement brings Americans together. And if you're interested in numbers, this model, combined with the standard staff-based approach, can increase the number of refugees we bring to this country. Now, I mentioned before, 2015 and 2016, my organization doubled the number of refugees we resettled in Connecticut because we had the support of community-based groups. I'm enthusiastic, but I'm not a zealot. I'm realistic. I'm not suggesting that every single refugee resettlement agency in the country resettles all of their cases, all of their refugees, through the community co-sponsorship model. No, it's not possible. It's not feasible. It won't work. But I am encouraging agencies to adopt the community-based resettlement approach as a complement to their current model of resettling refugees. Maybe 25, 50% of an affiliate's cases can be placed with community groups. And if every refugee agency in the country adopted a community-based model, it would allow us to resettle many more refugees. The United States should be bringing about 100,000 refugees every year to this country. If each of the 200 refugee agencies that are spread across the United States placed an average of just 10 cases per year with community co-sponsors, that would be 10,000 refugees placed in 2,000 communities across the country. And if about 50 volunteers are with each group, that's 100,000 people engaged directly or indirectly in refugee resettlement. That is huge. Multiply that over 10 years, and that's 100,000 refugees resettled under this model, and it will result in 1 million people who have met refugees, walked them to school, helped them shop, talked with them about their world that they left behind, and the joy of living in safety and freedom, or the frustrations of living in this country and trying to get a job, trying to learn English. And they will become these Americans who've had contact, close contact with refugees, will most likely become lifelong supporters of refugee resettlement. Community co-sponsorship is happening in Connecticut. It can happen in every state of this country. It's also happening in Canada. It has been for almost 40 years. They are the world's leader in community sponsorship. They call it private sponsorship in Canada. Over the past 40 years, 300,000 refugees were resettled through the community-based sponsorship in 500 communities. And nearly 2 million Canadians were involved directly in community sponsorship of Syrian refugees in 2015 and 2016. 2 million Canadians had some involvement in resettling Syrian refugees in 2015 and 2016. So if it can happen in Canada, it can happen in the United States. And what happens when there is strong public support? Well, let's say the governor of a state decides just randomly to withdraw from the federal refugee resettlement program. In a state where community co-sponsorship has been strong for years, within hours there'd be thousands of people protesting in front of the Capitol building. Public support protects refugee resettlement. Now, we all hope that one day many more refugees will be coming to the United States. The Refugee Resettlement Network needs to be prepared for that. True, our budgets have been cut, and in some cases, some refugee resettlement agencies have been shut down. But we are a resilient sector. We have private support. We should have private support. We've got the support of the community. We should have the support of the community. We need to start now to make sure that we've got community groups that are lined up and ready to spring into action. If the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security can restart their overseas operations quickly, we need to be ready here in the United States to welcome increased numbers of refugees in 2021. So what can you do? Well, you can contact your nearest refugee resettlement agency, ask to speak to the director, and tell him or her that you would like to form a community co-sponsorship group to resettle refugees. You're happy to be trained, you'll raise the necessary money, and you're also happy to be supervised, but you just want a family placed in your community. You're ready to do all of the resettlement tasks. Now, if the director says, we don't use that model, and that's usually what they say, they won't say, oh, we want to have control over everything, or we don't trust volunteers. No, they won't say that. They'll say, we don't use that model. Well, if they say that, you can tell them that they really should consider it, and that there is a brand new fund called the Catalyst Fund that is offering grants up to $100,000 to refugee resettlement agencies that launch pilot projects in community co-sponsorship. You could also give them my name and email address, cgeorge@irisct.org, and they can talk to me about the joy, the wisdom, and the incredible power of community co-sponsorship. Now, if the director is pessimistic, there's no room for pessimism in refugee resettlement, by the way, but if the director sounds a little pessimistic and says, we might not get more refugees for a long, long time, well, then you could say, well, we would be interested in co-sponsoring an asylum-seeking family, a family that is there in the community, got there on their own, has applied for asylum. They need support. In some ways, they need even more support than a refugee family. Or say you're willing to co-sponsor a family that has been here for a while, but is struggling and needs a little extra help. Don't let them say no. What else can you do? If you have friends at the State Department, call them up and ask them to revise their 50-mile radius regulation. What that says, the 50-mile radius rule, is that a refugee resettlement agency, like mine in Connecticut, must place a refugee family within 50 miles of their office. Now, if you've got a community group of 100 people that has raised $10,000 and is raring to go and wants to welcome this family, and they happen to be 60 miles away, it doesn't make any sense not to place the family with them. We need to double that distance. It needs to be at least 100 miles, and that will really help the community-based resettlement model take off, and it'll help the refugee resettlement agencies adopt it. What else can you do? Well, you can promote and publicize and celebrate refugee resettlement wherever you are. No more keeping a low profile. We are proud of this great American tradition, and we want to make sure everybody knows about it. In fact, there's a new book coming out. It's a graphic novel. It should be published later this month. It's called Welcome to the New World. It's based on a Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times comic strip. You might have seen it in 2017. It describes the life of two Syrian refugee families resettled by community co-sponsorship groups in Connecticut. So it's a must-read. Community-based resettlement has the power to dramatically increase public support for refugees. And public support can translate to political support. Political support can lead to an increase in the number of refugees coming to the United States. And when the US once again becomes the global leader in refugee resettlement, other countries will follow. Thousands more lives will be saved. Thousands more children will have a future. And for the millions of refugees sweating it out all over the world in squalid conditions in refugee camps, there will be a glimmer of hope that one day they might be able to build a new life in safety and freedom. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for a very moving presentation. There was a lot of great stuff there about the advocacy, what we can do. It's a great part of the conference about really getting down to the nitty-gritties of what we can do going forward after this conference. And I'm just curious if you have some comments around anything you've answered in the Q&A already, or anything that's already coming to mind.
Yeah, can we take questions?
Yes, absolutely.
So they can ask a question through their microphones?
Yes, so if all of the attendees, there's a little hand portion towards the bottom. So it's like a little Zoom raising your hand. If you click on it, our tech support can go in and unmute you to ask a live question. And I do believe we have one up right now. So if tech wants to go for that, it is Colin, I believe. Welcome to speak.
Hi, Colin. Colin, you're muted.
Yeah, if you could unmute yourself, that'd be lovely.
Colin, you're still muted. So is there something in Q&A that we can work on until Colin?
Let's check. I do think we just got something in. Yeah. It says, does the possible increased geographic dispersal of resettled refugees with community co-sponsorship come with challenges? I'm thinking about, for example, being 60 miles from refugee health clinic, making it harder, etc., for the access, and if you have found ways to address this challenge or certain.
Yeah, so the geographical dispersal of refugees has benefits and disadvantages. When we doubled the number of refugees that we welcomed at IRIS in Connecticut back in 2016, Yale New Haven Hospital, which has been a terrific partner, they heard the news. They said, you know, we love refugees. We love partnering with you guys. We want to take care of as many as possible, but you're just going to overwhelm us. So the community-based model, which you remember that map of Connecticut, spreads the refugee families all across the state. That has the advantage of making sure they get that refugee health assessment within 30 days at another facility. Now, the disadvantage is some of those other hospitals or clinics, they don't have as much experience with refugees, especially if they're out in a rural area where they've never had refugees as patients. So what Yale New Haven Hospital did was they said, we will brief and train those other facilities around the state, let them know it's not so difficult. give them a quick orientation to the refugee health assessment, and they'll be able to do it no problem. So yes, there could be challenges, but they can be dealt with fairly easily. Colin, are you up?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Can hear you loud and clear.
Great. Hey, good talking to you, Chris. Thank you for your presentation. So what I wanted to say is that I'm in Boise, Idaho, and in Idaho, we've developed a community advisor type model, basically looking for that trusted community member that's a refugee to assist new arrivals and anyone up to 5 years in all matters, and kind of be there for support, be there to show them the ropes of how to, leave their apartment to get to their work, how to deal with their employer when they're having challenges, everything related to that resettlement. And it's worked really well, but I'd love to see or know if the current kind of peer model that we're using, how it could maybe expand or grow and to incorporate your community-based program approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like you're poised to take it up to the next level. And that would be this full co-sponsorship model where the group is involved as soon as the refugee agency receives the arrival notice. A group that has been trained and ready to go, they're informed, they're asked if they can take that family, and then they find the apartment, they furnish that apartment, they meet the family when it arrives, and they do all of those reception and placement services that are normally done by a refugee resettlement agency. They do a great job if they've been well trained and if you're providing oversight, and they get enormous satisfaction out of it.
Yeah,
So
great. Okay.
Shoot me an email and we can talk more about it.
Sounds good. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Okay, we are over time at the moment. Do you have time for one more question? And then I think
I'm here all day. Keep them coming.
Fantastic. Well, I have to run off soon for another moderating event, but here's the last question for this event. It says, it's in the Q&A, what are ways that you ensure true partnership between your organizations and those smaller, more grassroots organizations?
Well, the true partnership comes with true trust. Nothing conveys your commitment to a partnership more than entrusting a group of volunteers with those basic services that are not only essential for refugees, but the services that the State Department is going to be monitoring to make sure you do properly. And we have never had a case in the 300 plus refugees we've resettled with 48 groups spread across Connecticut. We have never had a case where they have not met those minimum government requirements. They usually go overboard, and that presents other issues. We can deal with those in another conversation.
Wow. Thank you so much. So unfortunately, we have to cut time. So this is the conclusion of this event. You've graciously offered your email there. You can find it in the Q&A portion in the chat box. And then I'm sending also in the chat, if more questions arise up to 10 days after the meeting, you can send questions into this email address and we will do our best to get them answered and send them off to our panelists. So we are all thanking you. You can't see everyone, but we're all giving a round of applause. So thank you so much for being here today. And all the best to you. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you all. Keep the faith. Stay healthy.